The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. Today, Kathy Chesney, mother, community activist, and pastor at Riverview United Methodist Church in Brooklyn Park, will be talking with Tom Wright, author of Daily Meditations for Parenting Our Kids.
Well, good morning, Tom. I'm really happy to be talking to you this morning about the new book that you've written.
Thanks.
Daily Meditations for Parenting Our Kids. I've been reading it over the last few weeks, and I'm a parent. I have 2 teenage children, and I want you to know that I really appreciate the daily meditations, the fact that I can just pick it up in the morning and spend a few minutes with it, and it gives me a sense of quiet and serenity, and encourages me that I can indeed, parent my children. I understand that you've been a hospital chaplain, you've worked as a minister, you've been a family therapist since 1972, right?
That's right.
And a teacher, and now you're an author. And I'm wondering why you wrote this book. What inspired you to do this project?
Well, I've been interested in writing for a long time, and I wrote a newspaper column, a weekly newspaper column that was published by the North Suburban Post, or the Post Publishing in the north suburbs, Hennepin County, for a long time. So I've been interested in writing and have done that kind of writing, and was interested in putting some of my ideas and thoughts and experiences down in a book. And initially, interestingly enough, I thought about writing a book of daily meditations for people who are struggling with and recovering from shame, because I was seeing a lot of that in my counseling practice. And I went over to the bookstore, and lo and behold, that book had been written.
A few times over, I think.
Yeah. And so in thinking about the daily meditation concept, I realized that there was a need for a book written specifically for parents and done in a meditation fashion.
Okay. Well, how do you see the need for meditation fashion? Why did you choose that?
What I'm aware of as a counselor involved in helping people make significant changes in their lives is that daily attention is one of the things that works. Many times clients have said, I read this great book and it was really wonderful and it helped me understand things, and boy, it was right on the money, and 2 weeks later the book fades from memory, and a month later all the insights that they got from the book are not affecting their lives at all. And experienced that in my own life, reading something that moved me and made sense, but it doesn't take very long and those ideas or insights kind of fade and you're still in the same old rut that you were before.
Okay.
Several years ago I began some research on what I call Bootstrap Psychology, or the process of change, self-change. And one of the principles that seem to emerge again and again and again is the principle of daily attention. That we need to create a structure in which on a regular basis we revisit those goals that we've set for ourselves, that we take a daily review of our lives and so forth. So that theme of daily attention comes out of the self-change personal growth literature. And on the other hand, I've worked with a lot of people in 12-step recovery. And 12-steppers do use 24 hours a day, the meditation book for recovering alcoholics, Al-Anon books.
So they already have the discipline established.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
And they're used to taking a daily inventory, reflecting on their lives on a daily basis. So people particularly in recovery from addictions are already accustomed to that kind of a daily exercise.
Okay, well I can see then how that would work. I just wanted to look at a couple of them that I thought were especially helpful. And one here is called, it's February 2nd, My Recovery and My Children. And talking as someone, myself being in recovery, I just wanted to let you know that this hit home for me in terms of my own relationships with my kids. Okay, you start out here. Although we believe our children are grateful for our recovery, they appear indifferent to the principles and values that have changed our lives. It's like I want them to be as excited about how things are going for me as I am. And I want them to be guided by these principles as well. And it just doesn't seem to work that way. And there's a lot of frustration because of that. And you go on to talk about, we think that the evidence of good parenting is compliant, obedient children who agree with our values. Now, how common is that?
That's very common, yeah. When you hear parents or adults say about a child, he's such a good boy, she's such a good girl, usually what they're describing is obedience and compliance. They're not describing a strong-willed, independent child who challenges, but they're more likely describing a child who's docile and conforming.
Well, I must admit it does seem to make parenting a little easier.
Yes, yes it does.
But yet you know that your child is not developing his or her own personality. And that has its own, its own problems, its own anxieties. So what do you suggest for us in recovery? Those of us who probably grew up that way ourselves as being very compliant, obedient children.
Well, I think you start with the premise that the child is unique, that the child has a personality, and that as parents we're not dealing with a blank slate that we write on, that we don't create our children's values and intellectual ability and thoughts and beliefs. But if we think more of parenting as a privilege, that we get to live in the same house with little people who see the world totally differently from the way we see it, then we don't think of controlling or molding our kids as much as we think about curiosity and dialogue, in which we're genuinely interested in their experience, their feelings, their moods, their questions, their worldview.
I think that's another topic that you do bring up in one of your meditations, the idea that kids will question us and they'll challenge us, and how that stirs up feelings inside of ourselves that there's something, if we're being challenged, we must be doing something wrong. We must be bad parents. But what you're saying is that they are indeed developing their own personality,
Absolutely.
their own sense of being.
Absolutely. You know, we struggle in our culture with a heavy myth of the perfect mother, the perfect father, the
Tell me
perfect,
about it, yes.
perfect parents. And as you were suggesting, that definition of good parents usually is defined as children who are obedient, well-mannered, non-challenging, and so forth. And that becomes a curse for parents. One of the things that I'm particularly aware of with parents in recovery is they have this question, what's normal?
Okay, sure.
What do other parents feel? What's normal? Particularly if you grew up in a dysfunctional family, you don't trust yourself about knowing what would be the right response to a challenging child. And so parents in recovery often are filled with self-doubt that they're set up emotionally then when the child challenges them to question their judgment, to be uncertain about their response, which is one of the reasons that I wrote the book. Because in my experience as a counselor, I've watched many people in recovery begin to get it in their own life, begin to understand some things about self-respect and personal dignity, begin to let go of guilt and shame in their own lives, but they go home to their kids and their reactions to their children are automatic. That they're hooked and they respond just as their parents had responded to them. The challenge is, how do you carry your own recovery, what you're learning about yourself and your excitement about your own growth, how do you transfer that into the parenting dialogue? And the book is really aimed at that question.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to help adults connect with their own growth and then move that into their parent-child relationship.
All right. You do refer to the 12 steps or specific steps throughout the book. And why, again, is that such a valuable model? I assume that since you used it, it's valuable, and I know for folks recovering from alcoholism and drug abuse that it's quite valuable for them. Why is it that it keeps continuing to be valuable in a person's life and as a parent?
I really can't answer that question. I've only witnessed the result. I've watched lives go from death back to life. That is, from people whose lives were just a mess because of addictions of one kind or another, get into recovery. Often they go through treatment, then they start working a recovery program that involves 12-step groups, therapy, whatever. And I've seen some real miracles of change and growth. And the 12-step structure has often been a significant part of their personal journey.
And you keep reminding them of the steps throughout the book. I thought that was interesting, so that they can tie back to what's been successful for them.
Right.
And hopefully that will help them feel successful as parents.
Right. And as most people who've had any experience with 12-step recovery, it's not about alcohol. There's only one step of the 12 that even references alcohol. And of course, the 12-step model has been used for other compulsive behaviors and addictions as well. So it's not about alcohol or drugs or gambling or sexual addiction. The steps are really about personal accountability, growth, spirituality. The 12 steps are really about getting your life into alignment on a spiritual plane, as well as sort of practical steps of getting through the day.
Okay. Well, speaking of getting through the day, one thing that I find difficult as a parent is trying to walk what I would call a middle line between being not firm enough with my kids, maybe even kind of just letting them walk all over me part of the time, because I want so much for them to like me. I want to be accepted by them. And then going to the other extreme, of getting frustrated and being rigid. So you do seem to address that. Would you like to talk about that?
That's always tough, because particularly parents with any kind of insecurity themselves, for whatever reason, have a strong need to be accepted and liked by their children. And that makes us vulnerable to the child's exploitation of us.
You mean they really do try to use us?
They really do try to use us. They're really not so interested in whether they're using us or not using us. What they're interested in is getting their needs met, getting their way, and working their way with us. And you know, the kids don't have any scruples. They'll use whatever works. And if we've got a guilt lever hanging out, you know, they'll grab it and work it. But often what happens is we then flip-flop, as you've described. We'll be lenient and understanding for a time, and then we'll get fed up and flip to the other extreme and say, that's it, you're grounded, you'll never see the light of day again for a month, and so forth. And there's a middle ground that requires self-confidence, poise, etc. And I think of it as a non-anxious presence. That as parents, if we can establish a position where we're not anxious, where we don't get hooked, where, you know, sometimes it's as simple as counting to 10 before you respond to a provocative question or something by the child. But if we can remain more calm and thoughtful and not as reactionary, it's not only good for the child, because when they experience our calmness, that is reassuring for them.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
If we're anxious and angry or tense, that communicates to them
They can pick
wordlessly.
that up. Non-verbally, they know that that's
Yeah,
how
they
we
do.
feel. And so then they feel insecure.
Right, and then they may push more to try to get a definitive response, or their anxiety, their own insecurity will make them more hyper, and then it escalates.
Well, you have a very calm tone in your book, and it's also non-judgmental. And I guess that's the part I appreciated very, very much, that you could talk about these issues in such a non-judgmental fashion.
That was really a goal that I had in writing the book. I wanted the book to be encouraging so that the parent could acknowledge some of their own mistakes and failures, but not get discouraged when they thought about it. But to see that they could go on from there. I think it's hard enough to be parents with all the challenges today. The parents don't need to beat up on themselves for their mistakes. And it's easy enough to do. So that I wanted the book to be supportive, encouraging, uplifting, rather than kind of heavy or critical of parents.
And I guess for some of us, it's so easy to be critical that it seemed like you needed to make an extra effort not to be non-judgmental. And it does communicate quite well.
Well, it's interesting because if you look at the history of psychology, we had the first rush of blame the mom, which came out of Freudian psychoanalysis. Now, we've just recently gone through a second wave of blame the mom and dad, and that's the whole dysfunctional family theme that's been played out so much in recovery in the last few years, adult children of dysfunctional families. So we're in a second wave that tends to say all of our adult problems are the result of how we were raised. And of course, both in the Freudian version of that and the current version of that, it's real easy for that to be exaggerated and used as an excuse so that adults don't have to assume responsibility for their own choices and decisions.
Okay.
One counselor said, he said, in our clinic, we let adults blame their parents until they're about 25, and then we said, not anymore. You know, time's up. You got to take responsibility for your own life. Up to 25, we'll let them blame their parents. But,
well, would it be true then that as you're learning how to hold your children accountable, perhaps that you're furthering your own maturity?
Not only in that sense, but it's also true in other ways that that when we raise our kids, we have an opportunity to continue growing up ourselves.
Okay.
That as our children go through their issues, we revisit some of those same issues ourselves about responsibility, accountability, doing what you say you will do. You know, we want our children to do their homework on time and to be responsible for their housework. And then we have to look at our own self-discipline. And so in many areas, raising children keeps us on track, keeps us accountable, keeps us on our toes in terms of our own issues of personal responsibility, cooperation, getting along with people that bug you, which is the perennial theme in families. She's bugging me.
Or when 13-year-olds come home and say, well, my teacher really bugs me.
Yeah,
I don't
right.
want to do my homework, that kind of thing. Well, you yourself have 3 grown children.
That's right.
And could you talk for a moment about maybe the differences that you see for parents who are trying to raise their children now than when you were raising children? What are some of the special challenges? Well, that are both different and the same as what you had as a parent.
One of the things that seems to be changing, and it's been in the process of changing for a long time, and that is the age at which children begin to no longer be children. There's a childlike innocence that we associate with elementary school children, where they are unself-conscious, where they trust themselves, they trust their imagination, they're self-confident. And as children go into adolescence, that wonderful, innocent curiosity begins to give way to self-doubt and insecurity and figuring out what's cool, what's in, what's sophisticated. And that transition point seems to be getting younger and younger. It shows up in a couple of very practical ways, and that is when girls ask to have their ears pierced or wear makeup. Those both are symbolic of becoming grown up, and the age in which those things are happening seems to be getting younger and younger.
Well, what are the implications of that?
Well, that's a good question.
Why is that a challenge to us as parents
I think
in raising healthy children? Raising healthy adults, actually.
I think that the longer that children can be children, the more they will get a broad, solid foundation of emotional security. There's a book written several years ago called First Hold Them Very Close and Then Let Them Go. That if we can saturate young children in emotional security, nurturing, and affection and warmth and confidence, then when they begin to move out from the family circle to interact on the playground and the classroom and be exposed to the MTV and all of the media bombards, they'll have a foundation. And it's without that foundation, kids don't have an anchor or a rudder to help them navigate through all of the pressures that come at them as teenagers.
I noticed that you were pretty firm in one of your meditations where you did talk about media and the need for parents to monitor what their children are watching on television. And I assume by monitor you also meant decide what they should see and what they should not see.
Absolutely. I think parents have a responsibility to filter or screen what their children are exposed to, what ideas and images and thoughts and information go into their minds.
Okay.
And we can't assume that the dominant culture shares our values. And I think parents too easily abdicate that responsibility to the networks or the cable channels or the the people who decide what can be aired on TV, and it may be totally inconsistent with the values you have as a parent.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I've got some strong feelings on using television as the primary babysitter,
Mm-hmm.
and then letting kids watch whatever they're interested in, because there's so much on TV now. You know, when we were growing up, there were 2 or 3 major channels, and it was pretty much plain vanilla.
Yeah.
And now the variety that's out there and the kinds of images and values that some of the programming offers is not consistent with what many parents want their kids to.
I also wanted to ask you about families that aren't necessarily the 2-parent families, and I'm thinking both of single parents and then also of grandparents who are raising their grandchildren. Do you think this book would be helpful to them?
Absolutely. There's also another major group that I've done a lot of work with, and that's blended families.
Oh, sure.
You've got children from previous marriages now living together in a group. All of those variations now make up the majority. In other words,
You put them together.
the 2-parent family with 2.1 children, whatever, is now not common. It's not the majority of households in our community.
Mm-hmm.
And so the book does deal with some of the issues of divorce and single parenting. The issues are essentially the same because they have to do with mutual respect, cooperation, and dealing in a humane, caring way with people.
Okay. Well, we've been talking with Tom Wright about his book, Daily Meditations for Parenting Our Kids. And I want to thank you again for both writing the book and being with us here today.
Good. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Kathy Chesney and Tom Wright. Certainly this sensible and well-written book will be helpful to many parents. Thanks to all of you for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency. We thank you for watching, and we hope you visit your public library often.